Life and Times of John Wycliffe, printed in 1799. Preface. The name of Wycliffe is inseparably associated with the history of human development. Nothing, therefore, could be more opportune at the present crisis than to bring into clearer light those distinctive principles under the influence of whose inward life and force he acted so conspicuous a part on the stage of Europe. To do this, it was not needful that we should rigidly inquire into those peculiar doctrines and opinions which entered into his theological creed. We have gone as far in this direction as was deemed either prudent or instructive. We have rather sought and selected the ground which we occupy in common with the great Reformer. We have not forgotten the distinct distance which measures the interval between the 19th and the 14th century, nor through what stages of development and progress the nations of Europe, and especially our own beloved England, have passed. We have judged of the great man and his doings by the light of his own age. And though every true Protestant will find points of separation, still it should be a matter of devout gratitude to God that he so far enlightened the mind of his servant in the nature of Christ's kingdom, and so endued him with grace and fortitude as to enable him to withstand manfully and successfully the encroachments and the usurpations of a power which would have trampled the liberties and the honor of our country in the dust. The life of Wycliffe was devoted to one thing, and therefore was lacking in the variety of fact and incidents which gives to biography its chief attraction and interest. The record, however, is valuable as throwing light upon his times and as revealing the necessity of that great reformation for which he so intently signed and labored. Brief as the narrative is, its simple pursuit will convince the reader that the popery in the 19th century is the same with the popery of the 14th century, and will animate him, we trust, with a spirit of grateful attachment to those Protestant and spiritual principles for which Wycliffe and Luther so manfully contended. This book has 12 chapters. Chapter 1. Religious condition of England in the beginning of the 14th century. Popular ignorancy, the Bible was little known, defective teaching and inefficient pulpit administrations, ambition and corruption of the priesthood, corresponding degeneracy of the public moral, religious degradation of the people. The close of the 12th century was marked by the first faint dawn of that noble literature whose advances and triumphs throws the glories of conquest into deeper shade. The progress of a people in letters indicates the point of civilization and of culture at which they have arrived. Had the throne been filled with any other man than John, that embodiment and personification of human weakness, there can be no doubt that England would not only have taken the precedence of all the European nations in the race of intellects and moral improvement, but would have left them at no common distance. The single act by which he sold his kingdom for a peace with Rome forever impresses with enigmity the character of this prince. We conceal not the fact that the ecclesiastic hierarchy had been fast encroaching on the providence of the civil power, that the government of John was in danger from the spirit of discontent which characterized the clergy, that his kingdom was under the interdicts of the Holy See, that he himself had been excommunicated and was now threatened with deposition, that his excommunication, by reaching to all who had any intercourse with him, amounted to the annihilation of government, law, and property, the impunity of crimes, as well as the invalidity of all contracts and dealings, that in these circumstances he had but a choice of evils, either to submit to the power which was bearing down upon him with such accumulated and crushing force, or lay himself prostrate at the feet of the pontiff, and that to this later step he was counseled and advised by his barons. Still, all this does not and cannot extenuate his conduct. But for their manly struggle in securing the Magna Charta, his people would have been reduced to the most enthralling bondage. Under the sanction of the Pope's decree, the king recalled all the liberties which he had granted to his subjects, and wantonly broke the promises which he had sworn to observe. His doings rendered him obnoxious to the nation, and his kingdom was in danger. In their extremities, the barons offered the crown to Louis, the eldest son of the King of France. Just at this crisis, the monarch died, and England was saved, just from an ecclesiastic deposition whose aim all along had been to render the civil power subordinate to the spiritual authority, and afterwards from the degradation of a foreign yoke. Sir James Mackintosh says, when the barons originally took up arms against John, they exercised the indisputable rights of resistance to oppression. They gave a wholesome warning to sovereigns and breathed into the hearts of nations a high sense of their rights. But in this first stage, they knew not how to improve their victory. They took no securities and made no lasting provision for the time to come. Hence it was that they found themselves in open collision with the next occupant of the throne, and Henry, thinking that his crown was far from being secure, stooped to swear fealty to the Pope. His Holiness released him from his sovereign pledge to keep, inviolate, and several articles of the Charter. He had no sympathy with his people, and it was in vain that he asked the people's attachments and support. He depended on the power of the priesthood, a priesthood better known for its frauds and forgeries and laxity of morals than for its self-denial and holy devotedness to the highest interests of the Commonwealth. Society suffered more from the corruption of the Church than from all the civil commotions which shook England to its center. The people were sunk in ignorancy and superstition. The region of literary culture was approached by but few, nor did men of letters address their compositions to the vulgar. The popular mind was left almost untouched in taking its impressions from the manners and the life of the higher classes, became growingly corrupt and degraded. It must be kept in mind that the art of printing was still a thing in the future, that the writings of the learned were confined almost exclusively to the priesthood, and that scriptures were unknown to the people. Had the capacity of reading been as general in that act as in the present, had the possession of books been as easy, above all, had the Bible found a place on every man's table and been as God designed it to be, the book of the people, how different would have been the religious condition of England at the period now under review. Superstition could never have grown into such gigantic dimensions. The papacy could never have acquired such unparalleled power. Both had their foundation in ignorancy. The people were not instructed in the truth of God, and very few of them were in circumstances to procure a copy of the sacred volume. As might be expected, they became the easy prey of cunning and unprincipled men. The most degrading authority was employed to imitate and bring them into submission. Freedom of thought was denied them. They sank down to be the mere creatures of an ever-slaving power. The free and uplifting genius of Christianity was outraged in the vassalage which was imposed upon the human mind. We do not say that the darkness which had settled and deepened on the human intellect was unbroken. Lines of light, more or less distinct, were to be seen in the depths of the long night. From the time of the conquest, men had been raised up to protest against the corruption of the Church and to be the honest expositors of God's truth. Among the highest ecclesiastical dignitaries were to be found those who had loftier objects and purer aims than the accumulation of wealth or the cementing and strengthening of their political influence. While France was the stern foe of monistic corruption. While Amundsen, his successor in the See of Canterbury, was better instructed in the doctrines peculiar to the gospel, and held these doctrines associated with that feeling of spiritual humility and confidence which they so powerfully tend to produce when truly embraced. While the sentences of Peter Lombard illustrate the moral condition of man and the articles of the Christian salvation, and while Edmund could not have written it as he has done without censoring, at least indifferently, the false doctrines, the debasing customs, and indeed nearly the whole of the superstitions so prevalent in his day, such was the moral condition of the people that Archbishop Peckham represented them in a congregation of his clergy as in a state of utter religious destitution. To supply the serious deficiency, the primate submitted to the council a list of topics which in the future should constitute the matter of regular proportional instruction. This summary includes the Decalogue, the 14 Articles of Faith, the 7 deadly sins, the 7 principal virtues, the 7 works of mercy, and the usual sacraments. One of the 14 Articles of Faith, the first 7 relate to the mysteries of the Trinity, the remaining to the person, the sufferings, and the general meditation of the Savior. The 7 deadly sins included pride, anger, hatred, enmity, covetousness, and intemperance. The 7 works of mercy are to compassionate the hungry, the thirsty, and the naked, to bury the friendless, and to aid the sick, the neglected, and the poor. Of the principal virtues, faith, hope, and charity are described as referring to God, while justice, fortitude, temperance, and prudence are viewed as relating to men. These epitomes of religious instruction are thus particularly stated because they are frequently mentioned in the history of the Church through several centuries preceding the Reformation. In the present incident, they were published with explanations which, if really needed, implied the state of the inferior clergy to have been that of the lowest barbarism. Hence, the extent of the improvement proposed by this metropolitan reformer consisted in providing that each clerk should deliver 4 sermons to his parishioners within a year. These discourses also were to be on some of the themes above described, each of which was so far explained as to demand from the preacher but little more than the mechanical effort of transcription. Such was the provision made for the perfecting of the moral and religious manhood of the people. Their teachers were to address them on subjects of personal and everlasting moment 4 times during the year. And what was the character of the instruction? Was it of such a kind that it could not but contribute to quicken the life of the soul and ensure the development of true piety? How was it received and to what extent? The answer to these questions would exhibit the clergy in no favorable light. When Reynolds was called to the primacy, the spirit of unprincipled traffic obtained to a fearful extent among the heads of the church, and the people, neglected and untaught, degenerated towards the whole framework of society, became disjointed and broken. The 14th century set in like a night of deeper gloom. The reign of ignorancy and of crime, of superstition and of profligacy now reached its heights. The most fragrant abuses were sanctioned in the church. Cunningly devised fables were propagated in the place of the gravest and most saving realities. And wherever the spark of truth was seen and kindled, every effort was made to extinguish it. Chancellors had already lashed the clergy for their vices, yet nothing could exceed the impiety of the monastic orders. Their conduct had become so openly and shamefully scandalous as to bring upon them no common degree of odium and reprobation. Their wickedness was too notorious and too glaring to escape the censure and condemnation of some of the more pious and worthy doctors of their own communion. Shocked by the enormities and vices practiced by these monks, they ardently longed for a reformation of the Church. With these facts before us, we cease to wonder at the degeneracy of the public morals and the little hold which religion took of the mind of the country. The marvel would be, had it been otherwise. We know well how difficult it is in our own day, with a purer worship, a more faithful evangelical ministry, a more searching, deeper discipline, and a more healthful, vital influence, and with all the appliance of an unfeathered Christianity to keep religious knowledge and feeling. And yet, in the absence of all these agencies and influences, there are some noble spirits sighing for deliverance from the corruption of the times. Peculiar difficulties, however, stood in the way of a reformation. It was something too grand to be effected by the timid and the unbelieving. It demanded the faith and the fortitude of a martyr. Still, there were those who were ready not to shrink from either suffering or death in such an enterprise. Among these stands first and preeminent the magnanimous and immortal John Wycliffe, who arose as the morning star of the Reformation and whose doctrines so deeply impressed the popular mind. End of Chapter 1, having been read by Peter John Parisi, also known as Brian Dean. None of my audios are copyrighted. Please feel free to make as many copies as you desire to the glory of God.